The Broken Sword is a 1954 fantasy novel by American author Poul described by Anderson himself in the afterword as a romance, as in a tale of high adventure. Set in England around the 9th century or so, it tells the tale of Skafloc Elfsfoster and his would-be twin brother Valgard, and the clash in the realm of fairy between the elves on the one side and trolls on the other. I'll just get it out of the way now and bring up Tolkien, as I'm sure I'll do in every video. 1954 is, of course, the same year that The Lord of the Rings was first published. So with The Broken Sword, we have an interesting example of a fantasy novel which is not influenced by Tolkien, but draws explicitly on the same mythic source material that influenced Tolkien himself. Anderson includes elves, trolls, goblins, dwarves, and much more, yet his portrayal of these things could not be more different than Tolkien's. There's something to be said, I think, about American fantasy versus English fantasy. The Broken Sword is much more of a swashbuckling adventure. It's influenced by Robert E. Howard, and it influenced sword and sorcery authors like Michael Moorcock in turn. It's focused much more on the type of heroism that you find in sword and sorcery, and its main characters embody the type of pagan heroic archetype which is completely absent from The Lord of the Rings. More on that later. The final line of the novel is, "Here ends the saga of Skafloc Elfsfoster." And the story has many things in common with the traditional medieval sagas. It's a generational story, first of all, which begins with the introduction of Orm, who is a Viking that settles in England, presumably at the time of the Danelaw, and marries an Anglo-Saxon woman. He converts and is baptized for her, although he mostly prefers his old gods and does not take Christianity that seriously, and likes to live far away from priests and churches. When his first son is born, an elf earl named Imric happens to be riding by, and he encounters a witch who has made a pact with the literal devil to wipe out Orm's entire bloodline. This isn't a spoiler, by the way, this is just the premise of the novel, and fate or doom or weird or whatever you want to call it is the central theme of the story. The witch tells Imric that Orm's son has yet to be baptized, and so Imric quickly returns to his castle in Alfheim, and using his magic, he breeds a changeling in the likeness of Orm's son with a troll princess that he has captured in his dungeon. He then returns to Orm's stead and abducts the human child, replacing it with the half-troll changeling. The changeling is raised as Orm's own son and is called Valgard, while the human child is fostered by Imric and is named Skafloc. The name Valgard means something like battle, slain, enclosure. Val means someone who's slain in battle, as in Valhalla, Valkyrie, etc. We don't have a direct word for that in English, but guard is related to the word yard, and also garth, which is used very commonly in a lot of medieval stories. Skafloc I had to look up because I didn't recognize either of the elements of his name. It's probably derived from scaffold, which means snowdrift, and maybe lock, L-O-K-K, which means lid, or lochor, which means like a lock of hair. And by the way, for those who might want to come up with convincing sounding Germanic names for a fantasy story, they're almost always compound nouns like that. Val, guard, battle, slain, enclosure, scaff, lock, something like that. But neither of these names seem to have any thematic meaning for the characters themselves or the story, which is not the case in Tolkien's work, of course. The name Orm is the Norse word for serpent or dragon. Literally, it's the word worm, which is just the word both in English and in Norse that they used for all of these types of things. Skafloc later encounters a worm in Jotunheim, and it's like a colossal dragon or serpent type thing. In addition to the realm of fairy with its elves and dwarves and trolls, the Broken Sword also features gods and giants of Norse myth and the Celtic Tua de Danann. There are references to otherworldly beings from other cultures as well, as far away as the Middle East and Asia, which makes this very much a universal history type of myth. The Norse gods themselves appear in the story, particularly Odin and Tyr. After abducting Skafloc the Aesir, send a messenger with the titular broken sword as a gift to the child. The sword is very powerful but cursed, and its gift spells doom for Skafloc even as a baby. Here we have the second major example of fate being a major theme of the story, and there are many more after. This is another major difference between Anderson and Tolkien. Anderson takes the pagan route, depicting a fatalistic story, while Tolkien rejects this in The Lord of the Rings. Like I said in my video on The House of the Wolfings by William Morris, comparing this book to Tolkien's work is another good way of dispelling the idea that The Lord of the Rings is pagan. Pagan stories are almost always fatalistic. The outcome is told to you right at the beginning. The Lord of the Rings is not like this, and deliberately so. Elrond is said to have the gift of foresight, but he cannot see what will happen with Frodo or the ring. Fate is not involved. The issue is not decided until Frodo sets foot in Mount Doom. Along the way, however, there are a series of youth catastrophes that show the hand of Providence in the story. There are mentions that Frodo was meant to have the ring. Meant by whom? Fate doesn't have any meaning or will or intent. It's impersonal. It just is. Frodo was meant to have the ring by a person, which is God himself. This is a major way in which Tolkien departs from the pagan material that influenced him. Anyway, eventually these two characters, Skafloc and Valgard, grow up and become mighty warriors. Skafloc is your typical saga hero. He's strong and fast and skilled and handsome, and everybody likes and admires him. Valgard is moody and sullen and dangerous, and people generally hate him, except his foster father Orm, who of course thinks it is his true son. Valgard is the much more interesting character of the two. He doesn't know that he is a half-elf, half-troll nobleman. He thinks he's just a man. He ends up becoming a berserker, and in his rage and lust, he ends up killing many people that are very important to him, which he immediately regrets each time. On several occasions, he reflects on and laments his violent nature and wonders if he's cursed. He doesn't want to be a violent psychopath, but he is, because that's his trollish nature, which he eventually discovers. Valgard finds out the truth about his parentage and does not take it well. He realizes that he is essentially a clone of Skafloc and has no real identity of his own. And he is a member of an evil race, the Trolls. This makes Valgard, though evil and unlikable at first, a very interesting and compelling character to me, and I really enjoyed him. Valgard joins with his grandfather, who is the Troll King Ilreed, and thus begins the war between the Trolls and the Elves, and between Valgard and Skafloc. I won't say much more about the plot, not because I'm concerned about spoilers or anything like that. Everything plays out in a fairly predictable way, and as I said before, almost everything is prophesied or heavily foreshadowed ahead of time. Even still, it's a very compelling, very fast-paced, and very engaging, action-filled story. Personally, I don't even really believe in the concept of spoilers at all, and I think someone from the actual Middle Ages would have considered it a little silly. Maybe it's because we're so thoroughly saturated with stories that we have to constantly seek out novelty, but that would not have been the case in the medieval period. They would have heard the same stories and poems over and over and thought they were great each time and enjoyed them each time. One such story that they would have heard would be the Saga of the Volsungs, which is known throughout the entire Germanic world. There are early references to it in the Beowulf poem. There is the Norse version called the Volsunga Saga. There's a continental version called the Nibelungenlied. which was later, centuries later, retold by Wagner as the Ring of the Nibelung, aka the Ring Cycle. That story seems like a definite influence on the Broken Sword. In Volsunga Saga, Sigmund, the son of Volsung, unwittingly sleeps with his sister Signy and has a son named Sinfjotli. In Wagner's version, their son is Siegfried, aka Sigurd, who is the most famous hero in all of the Germanic tradition. The Broken Sword features a similar romantic relationship between Skafloc and his sister Freda, which occurs before Skafloc discovers that he is Orm's son. There's some interesting symbolism in Skafloc and Valgard being essentially identical and each struggling with his own identity. Skafloc gradually becomes more human as he enters this relationship with Freda and he leaves the world of fairy. But then when Alfheim is threatened by the trolls, Skafloc makes a deal with the devil of his own by having the titular Broken Sword reforged by a Jotun, and he then uses this sword against essentially an evil version of himself. However, the sword is foretold to bring Skafloc's own doom, and he does not care. He essentially gives up his will to live, and as he uses the sword, he becomes more violent, more unhinged, and more like Valgard. The Saga of the Volsungs also has a special sword which is plunged into the trunk of a tree by Odin, and it can only be removed by someone worthy. Sigmund himself is the one who draws it out, which I think was certainly an influence here. I just want to add here that the way that Anderson describes Alfheim from the point of view of Freda is really cool. The elves live in this sort of corporeal twilight mist. The fairy realm, which includes Alfheim, is invisible to mortals unless they're given the ability to see it, and their world is sort of layered on top of our own. Anderson's elves are these kind of glowing blue-eyed creatures that are said to lack souls and are at best ambivalent to man and at worst hostile, which is much more in line with the mythic and folklore depictions of these things. I think that was a sandhill crane. The elves also don't have pointed ears, which as far as I know is also the case in Tolkien's work. I don't believe that The Lord of the Rings anywhere describes the elves as having pointed ears, and neither do really any of the mythic or folklore stories about elves, but for some reason in modern fantasy that is the defining characteristic of an elf. If they have anything in common, it's that they all have pointed ears. Skafloc, like any great hero, is also a poet, and many times throughout the novel he breaks into verse. The verse that he uses is alliterative verse, accurate to the period. There's also an interesting moment when Skafloc goes to Ireland to seek out the Tua de Danann to help take him to Jotunheim, and he teams up with the Irish god Manannán mac Lir. As they're about to set sail, Skafloc recites a poem he composed about Freda in alliterative verse. Luckless is the lad who leaves without his dearest, sweetheart farewell saying softly in the morning. Colder than her kisses comes the blowing spindrift. Heavy is my heart, but how could I forget her? Manannán then recites his own verse to conjure up the wind in rhyming verse. Wind, I call thee, though unresting, from the deeps of sea and sky. Blow me outward on my questing, answer me with eager cry. From hills of home behind me, out through restless leagues of sea. Blow, wind, blow, my song shall bind thee. South wind, sea wind, come to me. Come to set my vessel free. Manannan's verse also alliterates a little bit, but the rhyme is clearly the focus. It's interesting, too, that the god uses poetry to cast his spell upon the wind, because that's definitely something we see in the Middle Ages. The word spell itself is related to the other use of the word spell, as in arranging letters in order. Spell in Old English just meant something that you say, and we have Anglo-Saxon metrical charms for everything from exorcising a person afflicted by a dwarf to preventing a bee colony from swarming. So that's The Broken Sword, a fast-paced, fatalistic fantasy story of war and doom within the fairy realm. Right now I'm reading The Night by Gene Wolfe, which is right in line with the types of books I've been talking about on this channel, so that will probably be my next video. I assume there will be a lot to talk about there. Thanks for watching. Please like and share and subscribe and comment and so forth.